Bangladesh has recently witnessed one of the most turbulent periods in its political history. For over a decade, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina Wajid's government has claimed credit for remarkable economic growth, infrastructural development, and social progress. Yet, these successes have been overshadowed by increasing authoritarianism, electoral fraud, human rights abuses, and suppression of dissent. Widespread public anger erupted in recent years, particularly among the student population, which demanded reforms and fair opportunities. These protests, often met with severe state violence, eventually contributed to Hasina's resignation and her departure to seek refuge in India. An interim government has now taken over, striving to navigate the country out of this political turmoil. In this video, the events that led to this historic overturning, the state's brutal crackdown on dissent, the students' resilience, and the potential future of Bangladesh, are discussed. Since gaining independence in 1971, Bangladesh has had a history marked by military coups, political assassinations, and power struggles between its two dominant parties, the Awami League, led by Sheikh Hasina, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, led by Khaleda Zia. Sheikh Hasina's early political career was shaped by her commitment to her father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's legacy, and the ideals of Bangladesh's independence. When she first became Prime Minister in 1996, her government focused on economic reform and social development. However, it was during her second stint in power from 2008 onward that Bangladesh experienced significant infrastructural advancements, digitalization, and an average GDP growth rate of 6 to 8%. Despite these achievements, Hasina's rule became increasingly authoritarian. The abolition of the caretaker government system in 2011 allowed her party to oversee elections directly, undermining democratic practices. Control over the judiciary, law enforcement agencies, and media further solidified her grip on power. Critics accused her of using state machinery to suppress political opposition and dissenting voices, paving the way for widespread unrest. Despite Bangladesh's economic progress, discontent among the general public continued to grow. Rising income inequality, unemployment, corruption, and a restrictive political environment frustrated many, especially the youth. The tipping point came in 2018 when students launched large-scale protests against the government's controversial quota system in public sector jobs. The quota reserved 56% of government jobs for various groups, including freedom fighters' descendants, ethnic minorities, and women, leaving a smaller portion for merit-based recruitment. This system was widely perceived as discriminatory and as limiting opportunities for the country's educated youth. The student protests quickly escalated, attracting tens of thousands of students from universities and colleges across the country. The movement became a symbol of the growing dissatisfaction with government policies, corruption, and lack of job opportunities. As the protests spread, they began to represent a broader call for systemic change, including demands for fair governance, transparency, and an end to state oppression. The government's response to the student-led protests was marked by extreme repression. Security forces used excessive force to disperse peaceful demonstrations. Riot police deployed tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets against the protesters, many of whom were students peacefully demanding their rights. Reports emerged of law enforcement officials beating students with batons and dragging them away from protest sites. Hundreds of students were detained, often without formal charges, as a tactic to instill fear and discourage further dissent. The brutality intensified as members of the ruling party's student wing, the Bangladesh Chhatra League, BCL, allegedly targeted protesters with violence. Armed with sticks, rods, and machetes, these groups were seen attacking students, journalists, and bystanders. The government, rather than intervening, appeared to turn a blind eye to these actions, raising concerns about its tacit approval of vigilante violence. The violence escalated further when several students were severely injured, and at least a few lost their lives. One of the most tragic incidents involved the death of a young protester who was allegedly beaten to death by pro-government groups. The student's death, widely reported and condemned, became a rallying cry for the movement, galvanizing public support and exposing the government's brutality. Despite facing unprecedented state violence, the students displayed remarkable resilience. They continued to gather in public spaces, holding up placards demanding justice and reforms. They took to social media platforms to document the protests, share information, and expose the government's violent crackdown. Hashtags like Justice for Students and We Want Quota Reform trended on social media, drawing international attention to the situation in Bangladesh. Student leaders organized underground meetings, mobilized support from different parts of the country, and adopted various tactics to outmaneuver law enforcement. Their perseverance highlighted the determination of Bangladesh's youth to fight for their rights and build a future based on merit and fairness. International human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, condemned the government's actions and called for an end to the violence against protesters. As public unrest grew, the government intensified its grip on power. The 2018 general elections were held amidst allegations of massive voter fraud, intimidation of opposition members, and media censorship. The ruling Awami League secured an overwhelming victory, further consolidating Sheikh Hasina's rule. Opposition parties, including the BNP, denounced the elections as a sham, pointing to widespread reports of vote rigging and voter suppression. Observers from the European Union and the United Nations also criticized the lack of transparency and fairness in the electoral process. The erosion of democratic norms under Sheikh Hasina's regime deepened as the government tightened its control over the judiciary, the election commission, and law enforcement agencies. The Digital Security Act was used to arrest and harass journalists, bloggers, and opposition figures, effectively silencing dissent and creating a climate of fear. Despite the government's narrative of economic success, reality on the ground was more complex. Widening income inequality, inflation, and lack of job opportunities plagued the youth. The garment industry, which played a vital role in Bangladesh's economy, faced criticism for low wages, unsafe working conditions, and labor rights violations. Strikes and protests among garment workers became frequent, reflecting dissatisfaction with government policies. The government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic further exposed the inadequacies of Bangladesh's healthcare system and social safety nets. Lockdowns disrupted economic activities, particularly in the informal sector, which employs a large portion of the population. The lack of adequate government support exacerbated economic disparities and highlighted the state's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens. By early 2024, Bangladesh had become a pressure cooker of social, economic, and political tensions. The student protests, which initially focused on the quota system, evolved into a wider movement calling for democratic reforms, free elections, and an end to government corruption. Amid escalating demonstrations, public dissatisfaction grew, and the ruling party struggled to contain the wave of dissent. Reports began to surface of growing dissatisfaction within the military, a historically significant force in Bangladesh's politics. Amid the chaos, rumors suggested that some military factions were disillusioned with the government's handling of the crisis and national security. The military's stance became a potential turning point in the power struggle. Facing mass protests and potential loss of military support, Sheikh Hasina resigned from her position as Prime Minister. In a dramatic turn of events, she reportedly left Bangladesh to seek refuge in India. The circumstances of her departure remain murky, but it was clear that the intensity of public unrest and possible pressure from both internal and external actors had forced her hand. Following Hasina's resignation, an interim government was formed to stabilize the country and lay the groundwork for new elections. This interim administration, composed of representatives from various political parties, civil society, technocrats, and student leaders, was tasked with addressing the immediate crisis and ensuring a smooth transition to a democratically elected government. The interim government's first actions included lifting media restrictions, releasing political prisoners, and initiating a nationwide dialogue with civil society groups. Plans to reform the electoral system, reinstate the caretaker government mechanism, and repeal repressive laws like the Digital Security Act were announced to address protesters' demands and restore public trust in the political process. Bangladesh now stands at a critical juncture. The formation of the interim government represents an opportunity to rebuild the nation's democratic institutions, but the road ahead is fraught with challenges. Key priorities include electoral reforms. Implementing a neutral caretaker government to oversee free and fair elections is seen as crucial for restoring confidence in Bangladesh's democracy. Economic recovery. Addressing the economic fallout from political unrest, rising inequality, and unemployment will require bold policies aimed at job creation, labor rights, and social protection. Human rights and media freedom. Repealing draconian laws and safeguarding freedom of expression are vital steps in ensuring human rights and rebuilding trust in the government. Institutional reforms, rebuilding and depoliticizing state institutions, particularly the judiciary, law enforcement, and the election commission, will be necessary to strengthen the rule of law and ensure a functional democracy. The international community's role will be crucial in supporting Bangladesh through this transition. Diplomatic engagement, financial aid, and technical support in conducting transparent elections can help steer the country towards a more democratic and stable future. The resignation and departure of Sheikh Hasina marked the end of a politically turbulent era in Bangladesh. Her decade-long rule, characterized by economic growth and infrastructure development, has been overshadowed by allegations of increasing authoritarianism, corruption, and human rights violations. The recent mass protests, particularly by students demanding fair job opportunities and democratic reforms, became the tipping point for her government. Despite facing brutal state violence and atrocities, the students showed remarkable resilience, becoming symbols of hope and change for many Bangladeshis. With Hasina's resignation and departure to India, the formation of an interim government opens a new chapter in Bangladesh's history. This government now faces the enormous challenge of steering the country back toward democracy, restoring trust in state institutions, and addressing deep-seated economic and social inequalities. The future of Bangladesh will largely depend on the interim government's ability to carry out transparent electoral reforms, promote human rights, and rebuild democratic institutions. The outcome of this political transformation could set a precedent for democratic governance and stability not only in Bangladesh but also in the broader South Asian region. The youth's role in shaping this future cannot be underestimated. Their courage in the face of state repression has sparked a movement that may redefine the country's path for years to come.